lectures here in world history. We're going to change time periods in Egyptian history. In our first lecture, we talked about the Old Kingdom briefly of Egypt, and now we're going to move on to the New Kingdom of Egypt. And both time periods have their accomplishments and unique characteristics, and we're certainly going to focus today on some of the important pharaohs that come out of the New Kingdom. So, we look at our constructive response questions. Here we have two that we're going to seek to answer. The first one says, generalize who the Hyksos were and defend why the New Kingdom is considered Egypt's golden age. Our second question says, describe the legacies of two of the New Kingdom pharaohs. Really, we're going to use the pharaohs to answer both of those questions. They're going to be kind of the cornerstone of today's notes. So what are we going to learn? Well, we've got three things on the agenda here. We're going to look at Ahmose and Kamose and how they rid Egypt of the Hyksos. So that'll really help us answer that first part of that question that says, who are the Hyksos? So we'll talk about that story. Then number two, we're going to look at the New Kingdom pharaohs. We'll talk about Hatshepsut. We'll talk about Thutmose III. We'll talk briefly about King Tut, and we'll also talk about Ramses the Great. And then we'll finish by looking at the end of the New Kingdom. All of this information will help us answer both of those questions, and we'll have some good information on the New Kingdom. So that's where we're going to go with this today.
So let's set the stage. We need to just touch on the Middle Kingdom. It's not a big learning outcome in this unit, but we are going to mention it here briefly. We know that the Old Kingdom fell apart due to weak leadership, and that's sort of a historical trend that if you look at any country or civilization that ultimately collapsed or disappeared, more often than not, weak leadership had something to play with that. Weak leadership can be, not commanding the armies and not having a good enough defense, running out of money, overworking or overstarving or overslaving the people. There's a lot of different ways weak leadership can lead to the collapse of a kingdom. But the nice thing here is Egypt perseveres. Though their kingdom falls, they're able to rebuild themselves twice, both in the Middle Kingdom and in the New Kingdom. So the Middle Kingdom would not be quite as powerful as either the Old or the New Kingdoms, but it would be defined for when it was invaded by the Hyksos. And what I mean by that is that's kind of one of the big things people remember about the Middle Kingdom. Sure, we had Pharaoh Hatshepsut who built super forts that are now all under Lake Nasser due to the Aswan High Dam that's been built on the Nile. But, what we remember now is just the fact that towards the end of the Middle Kingdom, Egypt wasn't ruled by Egyptians. This group of people called the Hyksos came in and took over. So we need to kind of start our story there if we're going to talk about the New Kingdom, because it's the expelling of the Hyksos, the getting rid of them, that actually starts the New Kingdom. So the Hyksos kind of came from the north. This map is, it works. You can see they kind of worked their way down this green area from the north and were able to settle right here in Egypt. And most people would want Egypt simply because the Nile had a lot of food. It had a lot of access to farmland. It was the breadbasket of the world at the time. The Hyksos didn't rule for very long. I mean, this map says that it's their realm from 1720 to 1570. That's not very long, and they actually didn't rule Egypt for that whole time period. But they did disrupt Egyptian history enough. This is an image of the Hyksos on chariots here. Chariots were a pretty new weapon of warfare at this time. So the Hyksos, they were Asiatic nomads, meaning they came from Asia. They were nomads. They didn't have permanent places to live, who invaded during Egypt's Middle Kingdom. They did not rule large territory. I mean, they were not expansionists. They were not coming in to try to make their empire the largest in the world. I think in a lot of ways, they were opportunistics. They wanted the Nile. They wanted the food and certainly the farmland that came with it. So the Hyksos ruled Egypt from 1640 to 1570. You do the math on that, you're only talking about 70 years. That's not a real long time in the eyes of history. Their capital was at Memphis, but they also had a summer capital at Avaris, which was a little bit more northern in the region of Egypt. Now, there were two kings who came to power that would really try to rid the Egyptians of this foreign influence. I mean, people like to be ruled by themselves. It's sort of a universal truth. I always use the example that if Canada came down from Canada and tried to rule the United States, they might, issue in some really great reforms, but if they're not American, we probably won't accept them. And that's just a thing that's happened in history over and over and over again. And the Egyptians are the same. Now, there were some people who were okay with the Hyksos rule. The clip that we saw the day prior to this lecture, the video did suggest that there were people who were ready to continue having the Hyksos rule. But one of the royal princes, Prince Kamos, basically said, no, my dad wants him gone. He's an important guy. We Egyptians want Egypt back. So Prince Kamos would seek to rid Egypt of the foreign Hyksos. Now, Kamos fought the Hyksos until his death. We assume it happened in battle, but we don't know that for sure. The records just say he died. So, we can certainly do the math on that. We know he was fighting the Hyksos. A very good possibility that he died in battle fighting them. So it would be Kamos's younger brother Amos who would rise up to power and defeat the Hyksos 10 years later, around 1570 BC. Amos was pretty young when Kamos died, so he had to grow up essentially to be able to lead the army. And sure enough, he does, and he expels the Hyksos out of Egypt. And that ushers in a brand new era of Egyptian history where the Egyptians were once again ruled by the Egyptians, which is how the new kingdom is started. So that Middle Kingdom period, really towards the end of it, isn't even Egyptian anymore. It's ruled by the Hyksos. The Egyptians say no more under Amos and Kamos. Amos is the one who finishes the job, and Egypt is once again ruled by the Egyptians. So that brings us to what a lot of people call the Golden Age. They say the New Kingdom is the Golden Age of Egyptian history. And it's not hard to believe that, because when you look at some of the temples and the buildings that were built, certainly there's a pretty strong legacy of some very, very important rulers that left behind some pretty awesome things for us to study. So the New Kingdom is often called the Golden Age of Egyptian history. So we said the Old Kingdom was known for its pyramids. The New Kingdom will be known much more for conquest and building of temples in the Valley of the Kings. You're not going to find any pyramids in the New Kingdom. You're going to find a lot of temples, a lot of really cool burial chambers, and things like obelisks, but you will not find pyramids built in the New Kingdom. Now, the Valley of the Kings is, it's really sort of unassuming. We've really only been digging things up there for about 100 years. You can fly over this with a helicopter or a plane on most days and really not know that anything was down there. But sure enough, as scientists and archaeologists started digging, they realized this was a pretty sacred place for the Egyptians, and dozens of important leaders and their tombs were found in this region. If we look at this map, this is pretty cool. It's kind of the overhead look at this. I mean, you look at every one of these numbers, this represents an important tomb. And we're going to talk about Thutmose III today. His is buried here. Certainly we're going to talk about King Tutankhamun. That's King Tut. His number is 62, which is right here. Ramses II, arguably the most important pharaoh of the New Kingdom. He's buried here. Some really cool stuff going on here in the Valley of the Kings. And this kind of segues perfectly for us, because what we're going to do here is we're going to talk about 4 of those pharaohs. In fact, 3 of them that I just mentioned. And the first one that we need to really get into is Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut really was remarkable, not only because she was actually a pretty strong pharaoh, but the fact that she was female just really set her apart. So let's kind of talk a little bit about Hatshepsut's story here. So the New Kingdom pharaoh starting with Hatshepsut. Now, the reason Hatshepsut was even able to take power at all is because her stepson, who was heir to the throne, was just too young to rule. The Egyptians weren't dumb. They knew that babies and infants couldn't, be put on a throne and make decisions. They often had regents or people who ruled for them that could, in a lot of ways, keep the seat warm, so to speak. But when that pharaoh was old enough to rule, they could rightfully take the power that was theirs and become pharaoh. In this case, Hatshepsut was going to do the job while her stepson, Thutmose III, was growing up. And she had the right friends at court. She was really good at making relationships with people. And so, essentially, she said, well, maybe I'm pharaoh. So she declared herself pharaoh around 1472 BC. And it's interesting because she knew she had to win the hearts and the minds of the people. Because if she had just come out and said, I'm pharaoh, nobody would have taken her serious. She's female. That just wouldn't have worked. That's not how their culture operated. So one of the things that she did is she said, I'm going to make friends with my enemies. So she started encouraging trade rather than waging war. And I say that's really smart because if you go to your borders where people in the past have typically been, fought and taken over by the Egyptians, now you say, hey, let's forge relationships. Let's trade with one another. They're less likely to want to take your stuff. They're less likely to want to come in and invade you. So it's pretty smart that she did that. On top of it, because of her exports and trades and things like that, her reign was very prosperous. And we have records that say, things were very good during her time. War costs money. Trade makes you money. So you can just sort of do the math on that one. If you talk about public relations, that's sometimes what we call PR. People need to look good in front of their people. She knew how to do this. I mean, she made herself up to look like a male to gain support. She wore clothing that hid the curves that her body had. She wore a strap-on beard to look more, male. She had herself depicted as male in hieroglyphics and things like that. And I don't think anybody was naive enough to think, well, maybe she is a man. But it was all part of the image she wanted to portray, and people bought into it. And so they took her more serious as Pharaoh because of it. That would normally sound like a cross-dresser in our culture, but you think about why she was doing it, that's pretty smart. She planned a very elaborate tomb in the Valley of the Kings called Deir el-Bahri, and I love this tomb. I'm going to show you several pictures of it. It's just very, very cool on how it was designed. We saw this in Egypt, Engineering and Empire, and like I said, I'm going to show you some pictures here. Now, Hatshepsut dies, and for a while there, we didn't actually have her body. It wasn't until around 2007 that her body was found, but we almost didn't know anything about her at all, because of her son Thutmose III. And when I get to his story, I'll tell you a little bit more about this, but essentially he had her erased from hieroglyphics. And the Egyptians believed that erased you from the afterlife. So she almost didn't survive history due to the actions of her stepson once he took reigns as pharaoh. So one of the things we know, she built a lot of her obelisks. We also saw this in Engineering and Empire. These are obviously what the Washington Monument is based on today. They're one piece of stone. They would have been very difficult to raise. All of them have carvings and reliefs on them. Very, very beautiful design. We found many of them that came out of her time period. Here's Deir el-Bahri. This is just one look. This isn't the best picture. The multi-tiered palace that she has. This would have been decorated with gardens and pools and all sorts of painting and all sorts of things. It would have looked very, very beautiful in its time. This is a better image of it. You can see built right out of the cliff face. You would have carved that right out of the cliff. You would have brought some stone in, but carving that right out of there would have been very, very difficult to do. And the result is just absolutely breathtaking. Here's an even better look at it. You can tell how absolutely enormous Deir el-Bahri was. And this is the tomb for Hatshepsut. Again, when I used to talk about this, we didn't know what happened to her, but her body was found. They actually were able to match up a tooth and her kind of a molar that was missing, and so on June 27, 2007, as it suggests here, using dental and DNA evidence, it was discovered that Hatshepsut's body was found. For years, her body had been missing. We weren't sure where it was. All right, we're going to end there in part one. We have 3 more pharaohs we're going to talk about in part 2, as well as the end of the New Kingdom. So we're going to come back. We're going to talk about Thutmose III. We're going to talk about King Tut, and we're also going to talk about Ramses II. So go ahead and hit stop and queue up part 2.